At the same time, while the attention and the resources of the Ming Dynasty is being focused northward to secure their border against these nomadic neighbors, especially the Mongols, um, in all of the other directions that China influences Asia, what you see during the Ming Dynasty is a massive withdrawal of China from the world stage. Now, when I say withdrawal, this doesn't mean complete isolation. China doesn't shut its borders and close people out. They still continue to participate and, in many cases, dominate the Eurasian trade networks, the Indian Ocean, the Silk Road. But what it means is that the Ming Dynasty itself, the government in particular, um, really withdraws from their position of influence within the sphere of Asia. Now, China is still, like I said, the economic world power. They still dominate the trade networks. But what you see is that during the Ming, the focus is withdraw from external threats and problems and an internal focus on reestablishing traditional Chinese culture and erasing any kind of foreign influence. Okay. The only foreign influence that's really accepted within the Ming is Buddhism. And that's mainly because it's so firmly established and implanted itself at this point that the Ming would probably only turn their own people against them if they tried to eliminate it. Okay. Now, the question is why isolation, right? The Mongol threat has been vanquished. There are no other states in Asia that could potentially challenge or really even threaten the Chinese at this point. So why the withdrawal? Why do they feel the need to not participate, to not actively expand their borders, to not actively try to implement their culture, their way of life, their political system on their neighbors like Korea, like Vietnam, like Japan, the way that they did in the past? Why do the Ming not follow the example of the Han and the Tong and the Sung, these dynasties that they admire so much? And a lot of that has to deal with the way China sees itself. And this again goes back to the idea of China as the middle kingdom, the eternal empire, the center of the world. Um, at this point, historically, China wants for nothing. Okay. In their view, foreign culture has absolutely nothing to offer them. Foreign religions like Christianity and Judaism and Islam, they've seen it, they've adapted and adopted what they're going to adopt. There's nothing else for them to see there. Technologically, no other civilization in Earth is bringing anything to China that they don't already have and utilize. China is the technological leader of the world in terms of architecture, right? Chinese architecture, for the most part, surpasses anything that's being built anywhere else in the world. Chinese naval technology is the most cutting edge on the planet. So culturally, the Chinese see interaction with foreigners as essentially a waste of their time. Um, Economically, China doesn't need anybody else. They don't need foreign goods. They produce essentially everything that their markets require. Their real only interest in trade is that they need to find foreign markets for their own products so that they can continue to produce at an economically very high level. Politically, the only threat that the Ming Dynasty really sees is, as always, the northern nomads. And because of this, they continue to expand the Great Wall further to the west and to the north. Um, but basically the goal of the Ming is to rebuild, recover, and kind of rebirth this, traditional Chinese way of life. Now, the Ming dynasty is not a particularly long one. It lasts nearly 300 years, longer than the Mongols had. But almost, fortuitously and almost as if they knew it was coming, in 1636, the Ming are overrun by, yet again, northern nomads. In this case, it's a military alliance between the remaining Mongol tribes as well as a very well organized tribe of pastoralists known as the Manchus. The Manchus live north of the Great Wall in a small peninsula known as Manchuria, and the Manchus then move in to northern China, take control away from the Ming, and they establish what's known as the Great Supreme Qing Dynasty, which we'll talk more about in the next unit. Now, unlike in China, politically in Europe, Europeans are looking to expand. Okay. They are doing the opposite of isolation. They have been politically isolated from the rest of the world for quite some time, centuries at this point. The Crusades was kind of their first reintroduction into the rest of the world. The Mongol conquest in Eastern Europe was an unpleasant reminder that the rest of the world is there. So in the 15th century, thanks to the addition of some Chinese technology and some trade money, European states are now able to and interested in expanding their influence out into the rest of the world. So, how does this all take place? Well, thankfully for Europe, of all of the regions we're going to talk about, they are the one that is most spared of the destruction of Mongol invasion. They are spared 200 years of Mongol rule and taxation. And this allows these European states, even though they are much smaller than the great empires of Asia, they're able to maintain their independence, whereas those empires like Russia, like the Islamic Caliphate, like Song China, are not. Now, at this point in history, Europe has been through quite a bit, okay? 300 years of crusading have left them depleted in terms of military strength. The massive death caused by the Black Death wipes out large amounts of the peasant and the landowning class. And what this does is this leaves kind of a power vacuum in Europe. And some of the wealthier, more powerful nobles who do not participate in the Crusades are able to purchase and in some cases outright steal the feudal lands and the feudal manors and castles of their smaller, weaker neighbors. And they begin consolidating them into larger states. This is where you see the beginnings of France. This is where you see the beginnings of Austria. This is where you see the beginnings of Spain and Portugal, right? But because geographically Europe is a rather small continent compared to Asia or Africa or either of the Americas, the competition for resources, the competition for land is pretty fierce. And war in Europe during this time period is pretty unending and perpetual. There's clues to that in the names of the major wars from this time period. The 100 Years' War between England and France is literally not even, it's more than 100 years. It lasts somewhere around 130 something years. The 30 Years' War, which involves all of the big states in France, again, lasts 36 years. Okay. And all of this becomes even more intensified once gunpowder and gunpowder weapons make their way into Europe from China. And the introduction of gunpowder, like I said earlier, is completely revolutionary. All right, not just in Europe, but in every part of the world. And we'll talk in later chapters about how Europe's ability to advance gunpowder weapons more quickly than the rest of the world gives them the ability to dominate the rest of the world. Also, the introduction of gunpowder makes knights and feudalism basically obsolete. There's no need to pay and give land to an armored knight who spends his entire life in training when you can simply pull any Joe Schmo peasant, off of the farm, and with a few days of training, teach him how to use a gun, and all of a sudden he's more effective than a knight who has very expensively spent their entire existence, training to ride and fight and joust. Also, during this time period, the length and the duration of these massive European wars, like the 100 Years' War, like the 30 Years' War, facilitates foreign mercenaries coming to Europe to fight in these massive wars. And with them, they bring more advanced military technology with them from Asia. Weapons like the fire lance, like the nest of bees from China, very early forms of muskets from the Arab world, things like the blunderbuss, which is actually invented in Europe, but it's based off an Arab design. Now, another thing that these gunpowder weapons enable Europeans to do is they're able to purge Islam from Western Europe. The reconquest of Muslim Spain, known as the Reconquista, begins in the early 1400s. I mean, it begins way back during the time of the original Crusades, but the big push begins in 1401 and actually ends the same year as Columbus, 1492, when the final Muslim stronghold, which is the city of Granada, is overrun. And this allows the reunification of all of Christianity within the Iberian Peninsula. This allows the creation of the state of Spain, which is going to become very important later on, and the state of Portugal. So, with Islam being finally pushed out of Western Europe, there is no more direct threat to European states on European land other than themselves, obviously. But this gives Europe the opportunity, this gives them the motivation to focus on expansion beyond the continent, and that's going to happen through maritime exploration. Now, accompanying this political consolidation, this building of large, powerful states in Europe, there is a massive economic recovery going on underneath that is helping to drive this. The death of feudalism after the Crusades and the Black Death enables single rulers and kings to not only establish stronger states, but allows them to more efficiently collect taxes, because now they've eliminated the middlemen that existed under feudalism, right? They've eliminated the lords and the barons and the princes and the dukes and all those other levels of landowners. And now those taxes can be paid from the peasant and the working class directly into the king's pocket, which is a massive boost to royal treasuries. And this allows them to invest in all sorts of things: infrastructure, roads, canals, housing, everything that makes trade flourish, right? So, naturally, trade flourishes. Thanks to the Pax Mongolica, thanks to the trade connections that were established during the Crusades, Europe begins to reintegrate itself into the big Eurasian trade networks. And the demand for Asian and African products in Europe becomes absolutely insatiable. Silk from China, yet again, but even more than that, salt for preserving food from Africa, gold, always in demand everywhere in the world, spices from the Indian Ocean, cotton and pepper from India. All of these products are in massive demand in European markets because, again, you got to realize Europe was highly isolated from probably about the end of the Roman Empire right up until about the beginning of the Crusades. And so this is the first time a lot of these products are making their way into Europe. So the demand is sky high, and wherever there's demand, there's going to be someone that finds a way to supply it. So during the 15th century, you see a massive expansion of the trade networks in and around Europe. This mainly is facilitated by a number of very powerful, very wealthy Italian city states. Now, in Italy, there is no single unified state, and that's going to remain that way until the middle of the 1800s. Instead, what you have are numerous individual city states who have control over the surrounding land and essentially form their own governments. Some of them Democratic, some of them Republican, some of them are monarchies, the same way that states like France and England are. But what's really important to know about these city states is because of their location, right? These city states are able to dominate the Mediterranean trade network. Okay. Italy is a peninsula surrounded on on three sides by water. So naturally, Italians are best suited to take control of the Mediterranean trade network. They are expert sailors, they're expert shipbuilders. Most Italians have grown up, their entire lives in and around water. So they reestablish trade with the Muslim world. They begin establishing trade colonies all throughout the Mediterranean and the Black Sea in order to be able to generate better prices in order to be able to kind of exclude their competition and their neighbors. Now, once these goods make their way into Italy, they are then filtered out into the rest of Europe through a bunch of different overland networks. And again, this is facilitated because you have stronger states being built in Europe around the same time. You have strong rulers who are able to collect much more in terms of tax revenue so they can build roads, they can build canals, they can, hospitals, they can, pay for an army to provide security. And thanks to this, you also start to see the creation of economic leagues like the Hanseatic League. These are essentially trade alliances between different cities where merchants from those cities will get better pricing at fellow league cities. They can find free shelter, free lodgings. They get treated better, in these ports, more security for their goods, these kinds of things. Um, Also, another thing that facilitates this economic recovery is that around the same time, banking innovations that have existed in China already for hundreds of years, since the times of the Song, are now finally making their way into Europe. Major banks start to open around Europe, which allows money lending, which allows people to borrow against their future goods. This allows people to expand their businesses. You also start to see the building of what's called joint stock companies. These are companies where the owners of the business own equal shares in the business. So no one person is on the line for the entire amount if the business fails. Also, during the 15th century, you have the creation of what's known as the Gutenberg press, which is a European variation on the Chinese style printing press, which actually is more efficient and more durable because it uses metal movable type as opposed to wood block typing. And thanks to this, now Europeans can begin printing paper money of their own. So we know the benefits of paper money. This allows for faster trade. This allows the easier movement of more goods along the trade routes. And all of this in totality just means more money in the pockets of merchants. It means more money in the pockets of businessmen. But more importantly, it means more taxes are able to be paid to that king and to the state. Now, this map gives you an idea of what the trade networks of the 15th century look like in Europe. Now, obviously, I know the map's in Spanish. It's from a Spanish textbook, but honestly, this is the best, most detailed map that I could find that really kind of gives you an idea of what we're looking at here. So you can see in the colored areas the different trade leagues that form and the different areas of trade influence. You have the Hanseatic League north in orange, right? You have the League of Champlain in central France. You've got the Venetians and their areas of influence. You've got the Genovese and their areas of influence, the Catalans and their areas of influence, as well as the different networks, right? You've got the Italian trade routes that dominate the Mediterranean, and then you've got land routes which filter those goods north, and then you've got Hanseatic trade routes that dominate the northern sea trade between England in the North Sea, in the Baltic Sea, and in the North Atlantic. As well as on there, you can see that there are several major banks that begin popping up in and around Europe as well. So again, you have more borrowing, more money lending. This leads for faster and larger business expansion.